So my next question is, how much can someone going through the redundancy process expect to receive? How is this calculated?
Yes, this is the big question. It's the old joke that in criminal law everyone wants to know how long, and in civil law everyone wants to know how much.
Mm.
First of all, there are two types of redundancy payment you could get. One is a statutory payment, which is the legal minimum that you're entitled to. Then you could agree, or there could be in your contract even a higher redundancy payment. So we're going to talk about the statutory minimum. Not much is the short answer. It largely depends on how long you've been there and how much you earn. But I'm just going to talk about whether or not you're entitled to a payment first, because that's quite important. So, and I'll wheel through it quite quickly. So you've got to be an employee. Now that's a complicated question, but in most cases you'll be an employee. But you have to be an employee in order to get the redundancy payment. So if you're a self-employed contractor, genuinely self-employed, you won't be entitled to a payment. And you also have to have been employed for 2 complete calendar years. So if you started work on the 1st of January 2018 and you're dismissed on the 31st of December 2019, you haven't got 2 years service. So you're not entitled to anything effectively. So the answer might be nothing. You might be entitled to nothing. And then the third criterion is that you have to have been dismissed by reason of redundancy. So it has to be the main reason for dismissal. It doesn't have to be the only reason. So your line manager could have been waiting to get rid of you for ages, and finally a redundancy situation has come around that's allowed them to do that. That doesn't automatically mean you're not being dismissed from redundancy just because you're being selected for perhaps other reasons. So how much? Let's do the important bit. So there is a cap on how much you can get at the moment, and for most people this isn't going to affect them, but the maximum weekly payment is £535 a week, I think. So if you're being paid a statutory redundancy payment, that's the most a week's money can be. Outside of that, how much you're entitled to is based on your age, your length of service, and your average wage before tax. You'll see that referred to as your gross salary, but before tax is just easier. And redundancy payments are tax-free, so what you're paid is what you'll actually get. Your notice pay will be taxed, but your redundancy pay is tax-free. Well, lots of boring tax reasons we won't go into. And how it's worked out is, like I said, based on your age and based on how long you've been there. So if you've not worked there very long, it'll be very easy to work out. But essentially, you get 1.5 weeks pre-tax pay for each complete year you've worked there and you were over the age of 41. You get 1 week's pay for each complete year you were employed by your employer between the ages of 22 and 41. And if you're under 22, you get half a week's pay for each complete year. Now, that doesn't mean if you're 42 and you've been at your employer for 10 years, you get 10 times 1.5 weeks pay. It's each year that you were in that age bracket. Okay. So if you have 10 years service and you're 46, is the easiest way to work it, is the easiest way to look at it. You get 1.5 weeks pay for 5 years and 1 week's pay for the other 5 years. So it's important to make sure that your employer is getting the maths right there, because it's definitely not the case that if you're overpaid, that's great, but you certainly don't want to be underpaid. So you want to make sure that they're working out where your birthday is in the calendar year. But again, employers are generally pretty good at getting the numbers right, but not always. And there's a cap on how many years service counts. So then that's 20 years. So if you've been somewhere for 30 years, it's the last 20 years that will count. Okay. So if you joined at 40 and worked there for 30 years, then it will be almost all of that will be then the last 20 years of that. So it will all be 1.5 weeks pay. Okay. Again, it can be complicated, but most people now don't stay at places for 20 or 30 years. We all move around a lot more. So it's usually going to be pretty simple. And what is a week's wage is the other thing that we need to deal with. And there's been a lot of litigation about what constitutes a week's wage. But for most people, it's what you get paid on a weekly basis. So what your contractual salary is divided by 52. And it can include overtime, but only if paid overtime is permissible within your contract. And it should include bonuses and commission. Now, I don't get either of those things. So working out my statutory pay would be easy because it would just be my salary divided by 52. But if you are a plumber or you work in sales, then working out what your actual pay is going to be quite difficult, perhaps. But essentially, it's based on your last 12 weeks. So the last 12 weeks that run up to the date of your dismissal. Sure. Not the 12 weeks that run up to the point where you're told you're going to be made redundant. It's the date of dismissal. So if a salary bump would kick in automatically whilst you're on notice, for example, that would affect your redundancy pay.
Thank you. That's helpful.
There's just one more thing I want to say about hours of work and how it affects. Because if your hours of work vary, so that say if you work in a pub or you work in a restaurant or you work anywhere else where you might work 10 hours one week and 30 hours the next week, again, it's that average of the last 12 weeks. And that can mean that when your redundancy comes can be really important, because if you work in the pub trade, for example, and you have a really good Christmas and you get dismissed within 12 weeks of that, then you're going to get a higher pay than if you get dismissed in March, where you're relying on your January, February, March pay, where obviously everyone knows if you work in a pub, you don't earn any money in February. So when you get dismissed can be as important in working out how much you're going to get as the fact you're being dismissed itself. And then, like I said, that's the rock bottom you should get. So your employer can give you more. In a big company, they'll often ask for volunteers and offer a larger payment to volunteer. But they're not obligated to pay you more if you volunteer, and they're not obligated to pay you any more than the minimum. That's why it's the minimum. And that's basically, I've been through that process. If you want to leave and the redundancy comes up, go to your employer and say, I want to volunteer, and by the way, can I have a bit of extra money? But that's the basics.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that.